to do what the book says, otherwise I'll be in serious trouble. So I got started on Chinese, and that wasn't a time when you could go to China because the Cultural Revolution was the Cultural Revolution that basically destroyed the culture of China was in full swing. And interestingly enough, well, in the years that followed, in the years after I sort of dropped out and became a hobo, really, everything went wrong. The 70s was not a good time to be alive. Jimi Hendrix died, Jim Morrison died, Janis Joplin died. All my favorite people were just dying like flies. And it was the mood of just apocalyptic sort of disaster. I mean, it was really a bad time. The 70s were not a good time. And it was at that time in the 70s that I discovered a poem. It's not a very famous poem in Chinese, but it's a very wonderful translation by Arthur Waley, who had died in the summer of 1966. Arthur Waley is, without doubt, I think, the greatest translator of Chinese poetry of the 20th century. And this is a poem about the great Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, but it's a poem that evokes a moment when somebody is walking in a sort of wilderness area and stumbles across a skeleton, basically, and has a conversation, and the skeleton turns out to be the great Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. And if you don't mind, I would like to read a little bit of it. I didn't have time to type it all out, but I've selected a passage because for me this is one of the supreme poems in the Chinese language. Arthur Waley called it the bones of Zhuangzi. I called it Master Zhuang because I find it annoying the way people refer to Chinese masters as something, zi just means a master. And so people all over the world then think it's a name, They call him Chuang Tzu or something. And it's just a word that's used as a suffix for all those names of great masters, like Confucius and so on. And I start sort of halfway through the poem. I saw a man's bones lying in the squelchy earth, black rime frost over him, and I in sorrow spoke and asked him, saying, "Dead man, how was it?" So he's talking to the skeleton. "Fled you with your friend from famine, and for the last grains gambled and lost? Was this earth your tomb? Or did floods carry you from afar? Were you mighty? Were you wise? Were you foolish and poor? A warrior or a girl?" Then a wonder came, for out of the silence a voice, thin echo only, in no substance was the spirit seen, mysteriously answered, saying, "I was a man of Sung," that's a small state in central China, "of the clan of Zhuang. Zhou was my name. Beyond the climes of common thought my reason soared, yet could I not save myself. For at the last, when the long charter of my years was told, I too, for all my magic, by age was brought to the black hill of death. Wherefore, O Master, do you question me?" Then I answered, and this bit I'm afraid isn't on your handout. Then I answered, "Let me plead for you upon the 5 hilltops. Let me pray for you to the gods of heaven and the gods of earth, that your white bones may arise and your limbs may be joined anew, that the God of the north shall give you back your ears." So he says, I'll bring you back to life. What do you think about that? And the dead man answered me, "O friend, how strange and unacceptable your words. In death I rest and am at peace. In life I toiled and strove. Is the hardness of the winter stream better than the melting of spring? All pride that the body knew, was it not lighter than dust? What Chao and Xu despised, what Bo Shan fled, shall I desire, whom death already has hidden in the eternal way? Where Li Zhu cannot see me, nor Ziye hear me, where neither Yao nor Shun can reward me, nor the tyrants Jie and Xin condemn me, leopard nor tiger harm me, lance prick me, nor sword wound me. Of the primal spirit is my substance. I am a wave in the river of darkness and light. The maker of all things is my father and mother. Heaven is my bed and earth is my cushion. The thunder and lightning are my drum and fan. The sun and moon, my candle and my torch. The Milky Way, my moat. The stars, my jewels. With nature, my substance is joined. I have no passion, no desire. Wash me, and I shall be no whiter. Foul me, and I shall yet be clean. I come not, yet am here. I hasten not, yet am swift. The voice stopped, and there was silence. A ghostly light faded and expired. I gazed upon the dead. I stared in sorrow and compassion. Then I called upon my servant that was with me to tie his silken scarf about those bones and wrap them in a cloak of somber dust, while I, as offering to the soul of this dead man, poured my hot tears upon the margin of the road. It's every time I read that poem, as you can see, I have trouble actually reading it to the end because I find it so moving. It is this wonderful tension between the Taoist serenity of the master, of Zhuangzi, who is at one with the universe, and the passion of the poem itself. And that's, in a sense, one of the themes that runs through my talk. It's something that's I think is very special to Chinese literature. I'm sure you find it elsewhere. But this tension between the hard-won serenity of the Taoist or the Buddhist, the transcendence of desire and passion, but at the same time, the reveling in that very passion itself. That is how I would characterize the story of the stone, Hong, for example. It's a novel about transcending passion. It's a novel about seeing through the red dust, but it's also a novel that just revels in the details of the red dust, the details of human passion. I chose that poem for this particular period, the 70s, because it was a time when not only were famous people like the ones I mentioned, Hendrix and Jim Morrison, they were all sort of dying, but it happened to be a period in my life when a lot of people died, suddenly, over the course of 2 years. Grandparents, my father died, and so on and so forth. A lot of very close people to me died, so I was sort of very much in the shadow of the experience of death. My closest friend at Oxford committed suicide, and so on. But it was happening all over the place in that time. And a lot of people were casualties at that time. I survived by the skin of my teeth. It's always a kind of interesting blank in my CV, Really perceptive employers will actually notice that nothing happened in my life between sort of 1968 and 1977. But, people are very stupid. Most people don't even notice, and I don't try and fill it with fake stuff. It was the period in my life when I did almost nothing worthy of putting into a CV, but it was the period in my life when I learned the most and experienced the most. I say that just to sort of put you off being purposeful students and networking and all the rest of it. That period sort of went down and down and down to the point where I didn't think I could go any further down, when suddenly, as miraculously, I was summoned to Australia. Literally, I had no real intention of coming here. But a very wonderful person who was at that time the professor of Chinese here, and I'm going to talk a bit about him later, called Professor Liu Sunren, got to hear by a roundabout route that I was working on the story of the stone with my teacher in Oxford. And he actually wrote to me, he wrote to my teacher actually, in characters that were so small that even my teacher had to read them with a magnifying glass, suggesting that that he said, your esteemed disciple may wish to profit from the opportunity to come to the nether regions of the world and become, it was couched in this, written in parallel prose. It wasn't just written in classical Chinese, it was written in parallel prose because he knew that my professor could read that stuff. And I got a phone call saying, I've had a very strange letter from Professor Liu saying that he thinks he can do something for you. And I needed something doing for me very badly because I literally didn't know where the next penny was coming from. And a few months later, here I was in Canberra. And they ate huge amounts of meat. I hadn't seen meat for sort of months, and they drove huge cars, and teachers got reasonable salaries. And I was completely flabbergasted by this country. Everything smelled different, all the leaves were the wrong color, and I just sort of wandered around in a complete daze for about 6 months, thinking, they may speak English, but this isn't even the same planet, But then I was just recovering from the 70s. I had sort of long hair, beads, and I wore sandals. I'm not proud of this. I'm just. And when I went to meet my benefactor, Professor Liu, I knocked on his door, and he sort of opened the door, obviously expecting to see a sort of Oxford student with a tie and a suit, and just looked at me and went sort of. And then he just sort of smiled, because he just sort of obviously jumped that hurdle and said, okay, well, this is the person, But I very quickly discovered that he was an extraordinary man, and he just took me in hand and guided me for 3.5 years. I used to meet him every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, and he would always have a large apple, which he would cut in half with his penknife, and then he would give me one half, and he would eat the other. It was a ritual that he set up very early, and he just took me through all sorts of interesting journeys into Chinese literature, philosophy, history. I was incredibly lucky. I can sometimes never believe how lucky I was. Then I went to China in 1980 in totally mysterious circumstances. Once again, I had no intention of going to China. I wanted to stay in Australia very badly. I sort of discovered that I actually liked the place. But no one would employ me. I was completely sort of, for some reason, unemployable. I went to all sorts of universities and tried to sort of impress them, and they just didn't want me. So I went back to Professor Liu, who was always my sort of, my kind of protector, and said, what shall I do? And he had a quick phone call to the embassy, and before I knew what had happened, I was employed by the Foreign Experts Bureau in Beijing as a newsreader on Central Television. I could have done some awfully mischievous things in that television studio, but I never got the chance because they wanted someone immediately, and I still haven't finished dotting the I's on my thesis. So I went later, and they sent me instead to the port city of Tianjin, which is probably as near to hell on earth as anyone could imagine. I'm sure it's now a beautiful city, but in those days it was recovering from a disastrous earthquake. And it was a really miserable, dirty, grotty, horrible place. And it had these huge sort of buses, articulated buses that just sort of moved at about 10 miles an hour, and they were dark, and it was just a very dark city. Once a year, a spring festival, it exploded into sort of complete anarchy, and people just ran amok, and there were firecrackers, and you just had to fear for your life. But for the rest of the year, it was just this completely frozen energy. And talking of frozen energy, the street on which the university where I taught was situated was the old British concession. I always thought it was wonderful to be back in the British concession, called Racecourse Road, Marchandar, and it had a row of plane trees on either side. And when I first arrived, I was very perplexed because I know what plane trees are like. They have them all over Europe. But these plane trees sort of came up from the ground, and then at about this level, they had a sort of bump like that, and then they went up again. And I thought, that's a very strange kind of plane tree. And then after a few days, I started to realize that the bump was actually not the tree, but it was actually, but it was layers and layers of nasal mucus. So it was a kind of frozen deposit. And people just used to go down the streets and putting it on a tree. And that was my introduction to public hygiene in the city of Tianjin. I'm sure it's much, much better now. I have to be careful what I say, I'm always saying the wrong thing. So Tianjin was my baptism by fire into the People's Republic of China. And it was an extraordinary experience. I'm very glad I didn't go to Beijing, because that's where all the foreigners were. There were 22 foreigners in Tianjin, and that was not a large foreign community. And there were 2 restaurants that served anything resembling Western food, and their Western food was a memory of Russian cuisine from the 1950s, when all the experts, so it was beef pujavsky, which I'd never heard of, and it would be chicken Kiev, and beef